Utah.
Mr. President, I'm truly saddened today that I must rise to address what I fear is a growing threat to our republic: the silencing of political debate by totalitarian mob violence on college campuses. I was not in Burlington, Vermont last Thursday to witness what happened at Middlebury College, but I'd like to read from accounts provided by two people who were in fact there, who saw these things unfold. They were the targets of the mob's violence. Their names are Allison Stanger, professor of political science at Middlebury College, and Charles Murray, author of several groundbreaking books, including the work The Bell Curve, and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. America deserves and needs to hear their story. On Saturday, 2 days after the incident, Professor Stanger wrote on her Facebook page as follows, quote, "I agreed to participate in the event with Charles Murray because several of my students asked me to do so. They're smart and good people, all of them, and this was their big event of the year. I actually welcomed the opportunity to be involved because while my students may know that I'm a Democrat, all of my courses are nonpartisan, and this was a chance to demonstrate publicly my commitment to a free and fair exchange of views in my classroom." As the campus uproar about his visit built, I was genuinely surprised and troubled to learn that some of my faculty colleagues had rendered judgment on Dr. Murray's work and character while openly admitting that they had not read anything he had written. With the best of intentions, they offered their leadership to enrage students, and we all know what the results were. I want you to know what it feels like to look out at a sea of students yelling obscenities at other members of my beloved community. I saw some of my faculty colleagues who had publicly acknowledged that they had not read anything Dr. Murray had written join the effort to shut down the lecture. All of this was deeply unsettling to me. What alarmed me most, however, was what I saw in student eyes from up on the stage. Those who wanted the event to take place made eye contact with me. Those intent on disrupting the event steadfastly refused to do so. It was clear to me that they had effectively dehumanized me. They couldn't look me in the eye, because if they had, they would have seen another human being. There is a lot to be angry about in America today, but nothing good ever comes from demonizing our brothers and sisters. When the event ended and it was time to leave the building, I breathed a sigh of relief. We had made it. I was ready for dinner and conversation with faculty and students in a tranquil setting. What transpired instead felt like a scene from the TV show Homeland, rather than an evening at an institution of higher learning. We confronted an angry mob as we tried to exit the building. Most of the hatred was focused on Dr. Murray. But when I took his right arm, both to shield him from the attack and to make sure we stayed together so I could reach the car too, that's when the hatred turned on me. One thug grabbed me by the hair and another shoved me in a different direction. I noticed signs with expletives and my name on them. For those of you who marched in Washington the day after the inauguration, imagine being in a crowd like that, only being surrounded by hatred rather than love. I feared for my life, close quote. The next day, on Sunday, the American Enterprise Institute's website published this account from Dr. Charles Murray. Dr. Murray wrote, quote, "If it hadn't been for Allison and Bill Berger, Middlebury's vice president for communications, keeping hold of me and the security guards pulling people off me, I would have been pushed to the ground. That much is sure. What would have happened after that, I don't know, but I recall thinking that being on the ground was a really bad idea, and I should try really hard to avoid that. Unlike Allison, I wasn't actually hurt at all. In 23 years since The Bell Curve was published, I've had considerable experience with campus protests. Until last Thursday, all of the ones involving me have been as carefully scripted as kabuki. The college administration meets with the organizers of the protest, and the ground rules are agreed upon. The protesters have so many minutes to do such and such. It is agreed that after the allotted time, they will leave or desist. These negotiated agreements have always worked. At least a couple of dozen times, I've been able to give my lecture to an attentive or at least quiet audience, despite an organized protest. Middlebury tried to negotiate such an agreement with the protesters, but for the first time in my experience, the protesters would not accept any time limits. If this becomes the new normal, the number of colleges willing to let themselves in for an experience like Middlebury's will plunge to near zero. Academia is already largely sequestered in an ideological bubble, but at least it's translucent. That bubble will become opaque. Worse yet, the intellectual thugs will take over many campuses. In the mid-1990s, I could count on students who had wanted to listen to start yelling at the protesters after a certain point. Sit down and shut up. We want to hear what he has to say. That kind of pushback had an effect. It reminded the protesters that they were a minority. I am assured, he continues, by people at Middlebury that their protesters are a minority as well. But they are a minority that has intimidated the majority. The people in the audience who wanted to hear me speak were completely cowed. That cannot be allowed to stand. A campus where a majority of students are fearful to speak openly because they know a minority will jump on them is no longer an intellectually free campus in any meaningful sense, close quote. Mr. President, I suspect that most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may not necessarily be fans of Dr. Charles Murray. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm confident that they, at least, would be honest enough and self-respecting enough not to condemn any scholar's work without ever having read it, like many of Middlebury's faculty members apparently did. But more importantly, I'm confident that my Democratic colleagues would join me in denouncing the violence of the Middlebury campus protesters seeking to silence Dr. Murray. On countless occasions, I've heard my Democratic colleagues come to the Senate floor to condemn violence in all of its forms. Why would this time be any different? We do not agree on everything, but I am confident that if Dr. Murray were invited to testify here on Capitol Hill, perhaps at a committee of the United States Senate, my Democratic colleagues would eagerly join in an open and respectful debate that would ensue as a result of that visit. I'm confident that they would reject any effort to silence or to do harm to those with whom they might disagree. In fact, I'm confident that if any outbursts like that happen, whoever was chairing that committee and the ranking personnel associated with that committee would immediately bring the disruption to a close so that an open, honest, respectful discussion could occur within that meeting. Mr. President, I know tensions are high in America today, and I know what it's like to be on the losing side of a bitterly fought presidential election, as we as Republicans found ourselves on just a few years ago in the wake of the 2012 election cycle and in the wake of the previous presidential election cycle before that in 2008. But that does not and cannot give anyone the license to shout down a fellow American, let alone physically assault him just because he holds a different opinion. Democracy and freedom and the Republican form of government, they all depend on an open, tolerant, and civil political discourse. And sustaining our democratic freedoms is perhaps the sole reason why the government subsidizes institutions of higher education in this country. It's embarrassing that teachers and students at an elite college like Middlebury should need reminding, but speech is not violence. Violence is not speech. And the totalitarians who fail to recognize this core fact of decency and tolerance are goose-stepping into some of the darkest corners of the human heart. If there's anything that should unite us in these polarized times, it's that the kind of violence we saw on Middlebury's campus last week must not be tolerated. That's why I commend the 44 Middlebury College professors who have signed a statement of principles on free inquiry on campus. I hope more Middlebury professors will join them. And in any event, I hope all Americans will join them in standing up for free, open, honest, respectful debate. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.